So uh, we are going to begin with an artist talk from Terri, our judge of awards. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Terri before she starts. Terri is a pastel and watercolor artist, as well as a printmaker from Freedom, New Hampshire. She's a signature member of Pastel Society of America, the New England Watercolor Society, which is, by the way, an enormous achievement, and of several other associations. Terri is particularly known for her light-filled figurative paintings and woodcuts and monotypes of animals. An award-winning artist in national and international shows, including a first prize recipient of our 2022 Marks of Distinction National Exhibition. Terri's work can also be seen at several New England galleries.
Thank you.
So, Terri,
Yes.
congratulations,
Okay.
and take it away.
Okay. So what I wanted to start with is how I got started in pastel. I always think it's interesting to hear how artists choose the medium that they most often work in. So in college, I majored in sculpture. And then when I graduated, I became a public school art teacher. And I quickly learned that you don't rent sculpture studio space, or I was working in fiberglass and steel, and that's not something that I would ever be doing with the amount of money that I was going to be making. So I was looking for something that I could do relatively inexpensively at my kitchen table, which was my studio space. So I switched to watercolors, and I tried to take as many lessons as I could while raising a family. And one of the people that I studied with in the summer was Marlene Losnica, who had a studio space in Pemaquid. And also, I think at that time she lived in North Carolina. She worked in all different mediums, but I met her on the rocks one day when I was plein air painting. I loved her work and I begged her to give me some lessons. So she did. And then one year I went back and I was so interested to see what she was doing in her watercolors. And she wasn't doing any watercolors. She was just doing pastel at the time. And she told me she started with pastel as a way to correct failed watercolors. And I was fascinated because they were beautiful. And watercolor, if you've done watercolor before, you know that there you can make changes, but oftentimes it's better to just throw it away and start over again because you're always going to compromise your paint surface. So I said to myself, well, I am going to start using pastels. So when I went home, our local arts association had a 2-day portrait pastel workshop with Charlotte Wharton. She's from Worcester. And so Charlotte had us bring a set of 96 new pastels. She insisted on that in gray Canson paper. And with her, I kind of honed my skills in portrait drawing. And also, she, of course, used a layering approach because you kind of have to when that's all you have is 96 new pastels. So I asked her, what do I need to do to get going in pastels? And she suggested that I buy a big set of Rembrandts and then slowly try to build up with the soft pastels. So I was intent on doing that. At the same time, there was another member of that took that same workshop, and she was interested in getting started in pastels, and she was retired. So she spent the winter in Arizona. And while she was there, she took a workshop with Doug Dawson. And she called me when she got back and she told me of Doug's formula of painting on masonite. Gesso the masonite, do an acrylic underpainting, and then make a pastel ground out of, then what he used was matte acrylic medium mixed with pumice. So I took her little recipe and made up some boards. And then I did some paintings and I got myself into my first pastel show, which was Pastel Painters of Maine back then, they called themselves. And I won an award. And my award was Wallace Sanded Pastel Paper, which I, of course, loved. And I decided that I was going to do more in pastels. But I still, I had a little bigger space then, but still, there wasn't a place that I could leave my pastels out. Every time I worked, I had to pick them all up and put them all back in the boxes. So I was still primarily a watercolorist, and I did a few pastels. And then in 2008, my husband built us a 2-story building. He needed a wood shop. He's a carpenter. So the downstairs is his wood shop and the upstairs is my studio. And then when I got this place where I could leave things out, I pretty much switched from doing 90% watercolors and 10% pastels to just the opposite. Because what I find with pastels is that you can leave it at any time, whereas any painting medium, wet painting medium, you're either trying to get something done right away before the wash dries, or you're waiting for paint to dry. And with pastel, as you know, you can put it down anytime. And so you can take breaks and keep looking at your work and seeing what you need to do. So that's kind of my journey in pastel. And so you can go to the next slide, Jane.
Hold on, sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so this is usually my usual subject matter. This one kind of shows it all. I like doing figures. Usually you don't see their, well, you can see their faces, but I'm more focused on what they're doing. I like doing paintings of people that are doing everyday activities and kind of having fun. And my other thing is I've always loved reflections in sparkly water. So this one kind of shows it all. Next slide. Okay, so these are two more, sparkly water, and then the tennis players. I sometimes really like to paint white or black without using white or black. I find that that's challenging, so those are two that I've done that way. Okay, next. Okay, this is how I usually start. So because I'm doing figures, and I know there's no figures in here, but when I'm doing figures, and they're not going to stay still for me because they're rowing boats and swimming and what have you, I'm working primarily from photographs. So I usually print my photograph out 8 by 10 or whatever. I do have an iPad. I was anxious to get one when they came out because I didn't want to do this anymore. And I found that I hated it, that I really like drawing on things and being able to actually cut images out and paste them, because usually I don't use a single photograph. So that helped me. But what I do is I always grid out my photograph in 1-inch grids. And then it's really hard to see because this is a watercolor. And when you draw on watercolor paper, you have to be really light so that, you know, the paint, you know, your drawing would show through. So I grid my final picture off in whatever it needs. So in this case, I think the squares were 3 inches apart, but sometimes it's like 1 inch and 7/8. I do a lot of math to do that. Okay, next. Okay, another method I use, I'm just pointing out, Charles Reed was a famous watercolor artist. And when I work from life, I use the same method that Charles Reed uses and most painters use. But what he was famous for was things like this. He also did still lifes, but his work was very loose and drippy, and everyone wanted to paint like Charles Reed at one time or another. Then just looks like he just slaps the paint on and does everything quick. So I've never taken workshop with Charles Reed, but my friend Peg did once, and we were anxious when she came back to see her draw really fast. And she said, no, she said, we spent a day and a half drawing the model because he would not let us go further until everything was perfect. And even his work, he erased and erased and erased all the time until he got everything lined up and perfect. And the other thing she found out was all these drips he's so famous for, those are all planned. That he, you know, it looks like he just let the paint drip and forgot to mop it up, but actually he planned all those drips. Okay, next one. Okay, so here's my husband modeling for me, and this is something that anybody that's drawn portraits before or usually drawn from life knows about, using what they call a constant. So in this case, I'm using my husband's head as the constant measurement. So I take my fingers and I figure out how tall his head is, and then I measure down to his hand or to his foot. And if his if it's 3 heads down to the bottom of his fingers, I make a mark there, and so on. And Charles Reed uses this. Charlotte Wharton used this a lot. And we did portraits with her, so we use the eye as a unit of measurement. And so you can see that. And then on my paper,
I'm
that
sorry.
head is bigger or smaller. And so you can see how I've started to do that. And then the next one you see is, well, you see the lines. I use directional lines to try to determine the slant of different things. And I just keep going until I get something that is accurate. This is nowhere near done. But I wanted to point this out because you don't have to grid anything off. You can do it this way. In fact, years ago, before everything was digital and all of our photographs were these 4x6 pieces of shiny paper, I would do the same thing, maybe taking a ruler and using my finger on the ruler. So maybe the person's head was a 1/4 of an inch tall, and I would find out how many 1/4 of an inch lines there were there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when I do ones with multiple figures, there is multiple photographs, or sometimes I'll have somebody pose for me. The top one on the right, the guy's hand that's on the chair, the bar chair there, that's my husband's arm. I wanted him leaning back like that. And then in the photograph, I didn't have that, nor did I have the waiters and waitresses going to the wait station in the background. The skiers, that's several photographs. And so when I do my grid lines, I might do the grid line for the woman in the red parka, and then erase all the grid lines and redraw a different size until I get my sizing perfect. And I mix it, like I said, I mix it up. Sometimes it's from life, sometimes not. I did want to point out on the skier one, I often use Reeves BFK paper. It's a printmaking paper, something I learned from Sally Strand. She didn't show us how to do that, but she did show a bunch of slides of her work and told what they were on. And when she said Reeves BFK, we were all like, well, that's a really smooth surface. How did you do that? But I find it does have plenty of tooth on it, and it works pretty good, and it's very changeable. And that snowboarder coming in there, I had another guy kind of walking off with his skis, and my friend Carl came over. He's a good painter, or he was, he's passed now, but he was a good painter. And he was very, very harsh with his critiques of other people's works. And he said, Brooksy, get that out of there. He says, you got this nice, he says, you're better than that. You got this nice S curve, and then you got that stupid guy walking out. And I thought, well, let's Reeves BFK, what am I going to do? And I found that I just took a clean brush, soft brush, and I wet it, and I got it back to, we're not ever going to get back to white, but I got it back to a earth tone. And I drew another figure and did another underpainting just on that one side and finished the painting that way. Okay, next one. Okay, these are more. The one of the Corpus Christi, that's the Corpus Christi Ballet. We went there in December, and my son's sister-in-law works, she's a teacher at the Corpus Christi Ballet, and this is their Nutcracker dress rehearsal. So that's from several photographs. I found that I couldn't move around because I was at a dress rehearsal. I just sit in one chair. So I took as many as I could to do that. And then the one of my husband and his skis, that's largely done from life, because I could force him to pose like that. Okay, next. Okay, so after I get my drawing done, and sometimes before, I work on trying to establish my color dominance. And this is important to me. So I start to think, what is my intent, my color intent in each painting? And I get this whole way of working from my studies with Skip Lawrence. He was, or he is, he's retired now, but when my kids got a little older, I was able to take 2-week workshops on the coast of Maine with Skip Lawrence. And he really established or helped people establish what was their strength and how they were going to say it with color dominance. Okay, next slide. So The way he explained that is this: we all know what hue is. We know what value is. Hue is the name of the color and how it's mixed. Value is what happens when we add white or black to a color. And intensity is what happens when we add the opposite to a color. And this photograph didn't work out as well in my, this is an old chart I made for when I was teaching school. But if you put blue next to orange, they will make one another appear brighter. If you mix blue and orange, you're going to get brown. And so that's kind of showing what intensity is. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is Skip's book. And where am I here? He wrote this book in 1994. And I picked it up at one of the bookstores, and I was looking through it, and I found that he taught in Pemaquid every year, and I really wanted to take his workshop. And I thought what I was going to learn is these marvelous loose plein air watercolors. And so in 1997, so that was 3 years after he wrote this book, was when I was first able to take his workshop. And I got there and I've got my little book in hand ready for him to sign it and everything. And he said, well, you know, I don't paint like this anymore, don't you? And I said, no. And so he showed the whole class what he was doing. And he was using watercolor more like wash, really slapping it on there very thick. But people would say, well, why don't you just use acrylic? But it has a different look to it because of the gum arabic in it. So anyway, we first couple of days we went out and we started doing plein air, and then the third day he said, I'm done with this, we're not doing plein air anymore. And we were all like, why? And he said, because I'm tired of looking at your bad paintings. I was like, what? And he goes, well, those of you that have done plein air a lot know that you can't just stand in front of the Pemaquid Lighthouse all day long and paint it, because the light's going to change. And so when we get to the critique, I've either got a bunch of half-finished paintings or some really bad ones that people just kept changing the light. And he said, I'm sick of that. He said, I'm sick of looking at your bad paintings. He said, you go out and paint if you want, or make some sketches and come back here and paint at the hotel, which is where it was kind of the central location of it. And, or you can just paint whatever you want. And he said, all I want is for you to bring at least one finished painting to the critique tomorrow morning. And so I don't think I've ever taken a workshop where everybody was so invested, but there were like 25, sometimes 30 people in his workshops, and no one ever went to the critique with nothing in their hands, because he would shame you if you did that. So, but what he did with each student just amazed me, because he looked at everybody's work and saw where their interests were and where their forte was, and he would push that. So with me, I think at the end of the few years I studied for, I was the only one that was working in transparent watercolor. And every time I try to do something different, he'd say, no, this is what I want you to do. So anyway, I got a lot out of that. It was remarkable, the amount of art teaching. And he would let people come with any media. We even had a few pastel artists in our class. Okay, next. Okay, so this is how Skip explained color to us. I'm not sure this is all in his book or whether it was just from his workshop, but he would explain color as divided into 4 types. One is hue. That is the brightest version of any color. And as pastelists, we just take whatever the bright ones are in our box. And watercolor, any other kind of painting, it's how it comes out of the tube. That's the brightest that you can get it. Tint is a color mixed with white. And again, we select tints in pastel. Watercolor, you make them lighter with water, and oil, you make it lighter with white. Tone is a grayed down version of the color. And if you can think of ish colors, so when I was teaching, I used to explain it to my middle schoolers as think ish, like when you ask your mother, are my greenish pants dry? We all know what color that is, that olive green. And so the ish colors are when you gray the color down. Shade is the darkest version that you can have. And in pastel, we all say, thank you, Terry Ludwig. Okay, next. So I try to organize my palette in this way. So each palette that I have, I try to have the clean, well, if you look at this, you can see I mixed them up a little bit because I'm kind of a messy painter, but the clean colors together, the light tints together, the grayed down version of the color together, and then the darks together. Okay, next. All right, so this is one I did for a workshop, a watercolor workshop I taught a while ago, showing the 3 types of color dominance. Okay, so what Skip would say is you want one of those colors to be the most prominent and the other one to be less. So more than 50% of one type and less than 50% of the other. So a value painting is what probably 90% of the paintings in the world are. And you can use whatever color you want. You're going to have something be almost white. You're going to go to almost black, and we use value to model form. And that's important to know, because when you do the other two, if you try doing the other two, if you try to model the form too much or use too much value, you're going to lose the effect. Intensity is the one that Skip always pushed me towards. He kept looking at my work and he said, you seem to try to get this glowing color a lot. And he said, you're never going to get it by having too much detail or any white or black. And so he would have me using grayed down tones next to tints, which is done here. You can also do the same thing with shade versus hue. And if you think of Tony Elaine's work, his work sometimes has that glowing quality. And if you look at it, he'll have some really dark shades next to bright hues in order to get that. A contrast in hue is simply doing, back a little bit, contrast in hue is simply taking one color to be dominant and then another color that is less. And those, I don't do that very often. That is, gives you a very contemporary look to your work. If you think post-impressionism and beyond, tends to be flat, because again, once you model the form with value, you're going to have a value painting. And so that's a hue painting. Okay, you can go on to the next. Okay, so here's 3 of my pieces that are based on intensity. The top one on the left is a watercolor, and so I use both hue and shade and tint and tone. In the sky, there are clean tints next to grays. In the mountains, there are dark shades next to bright hues. Okay, so there's a glowing effect. The one I did for CMPS that I won the award for, I did kind of use too much dark in the hair. It still has somewhat of an intensity effect with it. But, you know, in the end, you have to look at it as a painting. And when I had the hair lighter, it just didn't work for me. So I got it darker. The one at the bottom, one thing about intensity paintings is they're very hard to photograph because your camera is searching for black and white. So this one, the colors, they still aren't right. You know, I think that's probably the best image I got of them. But the pink in the inner tube is really quite bright and light, and the, you know, lime greens and stuff stand out. And I think the sunglasses and the hair and the girl on the right are much grayer than that in the actual painting. This ended up looking too dark. Okay, next. Here's some example using a contrast and hue. And I asked Bernadette and Eileen if I could use one of their images, because I almost never do this. I don't really know that I have any that are successfully done this way. And again, they tend to be very abstract and contemporary. Bernadette, of course, has used a lot of blue and then some red and orange as a relief. And it doesn't have to be that warm, cool thing. Eileen has used a lot of purple and then the green and pinks in there, and she does have a little bit of shade in there. So you can put a little bit of something else. But again, when you start modeling form with changes in values, you're going to lose it. Okay, next. Okay, so I saved the value one for last because this is the thing that Skip really pushes in his workshops. If you're doing a painting that's based on value, the organizational task is a little bit more difficult. And I just put in a value chart because I just felt like every art class I ever took in college and beyond, somebody's always asked me to do a value chart. And I asked my students to do them, and nobody likes doing them, but there they are. And so it kind of jogs your little art school nightmares. So what Skip would say are, you first of all, you have to have that dominance of one thing over another. So are your middle values skewing towards the light end, or are they skewing towards the dark end of the spectrum? Because if you use every color and every value, it will soon get to be confusing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so it's a lot of reason why we do a value sketch is to do this. So in this one, and you can see that I changed the image somewhat. When I do a value sketch, I don't really care as much about making it look real or whatever. I just want to get those values done. So in this case, I wanted the middle values to skew towards the light, which then leaves the dark figure to come forward. Okay, next one. And if you're, I use Photoshop a lot with this because if your photograph is close to what you're going to do, and you're not making a huge amount of changes, to me, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel when you can do it so quickly with the computer. So it helps me with my simplification. I think the middle one is actually what the photo is. This is called threshold in Photoshop. I don't know. I'm sure every editing program has something like this. I think you can do it on your phone too. But just I print it off, and I try to, if I take that slider bar, I can make it more dark, or I can go the other way and make it more light. So I'm looking at this to establish that dominance. It doesn't necessarily have to be a value painting. You could think of the one in the middle as having that dark area be grayed down colors and the light area be tints. Or you could think of it as the dark area being all blues and the light area being your warm colors. But it just helps, that slider bar really helps with that, getting that dominance. Okay, next. Okay, so here's two of my paintings. The one on the left is a watercolor where the middle values skew towards the light. And the one on the right is a pastel where the middle values skew towards the dark. Next slide. Okay, so when I teach, I do this with students too, is when you all have your phone and you can take a picture and just put it into grayscale. So especially with the girl and the dog, you can see that, if you go back just once, Jane, is that even though it's green, blue, and yellow, now go forward, those colors are all the same value, so they get lost. So then my dominance, you can see my value dominance stays together. The dog, you can pretty much see it in the color version too, because the color version is pretty muted. It's pretty much a black and white painting. Okay, next. Okay, so underpainting, that's always my favorite part of painting, because I think painting has a cadence to it. First, you're trying to figure out what you want to paint, what you want to say about the subject. So what kind of color organization are you going to use, and so on. So that's slow. And then getting the drawing accurate, that's also slow. And then the underpainting, and I usually do my underpaintings, so that's a fast part of it, the underpainting, just getting that color down quickly. And then as you work towards the pastel, first you're going pretty fast, and then at the end you slow way down. I do my underpaintings in watercolor because I'm a watercolorist. And this was done on Lux Archival, I believe. And any type of sanded paper or Reeves BFK, there's no sizing in it like watercolor paper. So your colors are going to flow together. So I'm pretty much just trying to get things down. Sometimes I do my underpainting in the same colors I'm going to use. Other times I do it in opposite colors. Okay, next slide. Oh, and I don't have a finished version of that because one of my big things that nuts I haven't cracked yet is Enduring Brilliance. I want to get it in, and I like that painting. And of course, you can't show it if you're going to enter it in that show. So hopefully you'll see it in that show. If not, maybe somewhere else. Okay, so this is one that I recently finished, and I don't always take pictures of my underpaintings. But I have done in a couple of recent ones, so I'm showing, but the underpainting and the finished piece. So that one's a similar color. And then moving on. Okay, so here's my boats again. I decided, and I often do this, I'll do something in watercolor, and sometimes I do it a few times with a few different color organizations with it, and then I'll do it in pastel. So in this case, you can see the lines because I don't need to keep them light because pastel is heavier medium and I can cover them all up. And my photos are a little squished in here when I transferred them. So that it's not a square painting. It's on 20 by 26 UART. But this one I did in complementary colors. So I painted it with orange, and then I'm going over it with the blue. That's as far as I've gotten on it. As far as the way I paint with pastels, I don't have a lot of slides to show you, but I am a layerer, probably because of my watercolor background and, you know, the few beginning classes I had with Charlotte Wharton, but I tend to start with a fairly soft pastel. This one is done with mostly Terry Ludwig's. And then I go over them with glazes of different colors. And so what pastels can't I live without? Well, I love my Terry Ludwig's and my Giroux the most. But the other thing, and I think I responded to something on the Facebook page of PSA today about that. Somebody was bemoaning the fact that Prismacolor now doesn't sell open stock at all anymore. And that bothers me too. But I don't even know where this person lives. She was looking for browns. If anybody wants brown, I have trays and trays of brown pastels because I don't use brown very often. I tend to, the colors in the new pastels that I can't live without are all the oranges and the turquoises, lime green and red violet, and some of the pinks. And I glaze over. So if I want to neutralize something, I'll go over it with turquoise and then go over it with orange. And I keep cooling it down and warming it up until I get what I want. Okay, next. Okay, I tend to work in a series. These are some of my inner tube series. These two women are actually there. I don't have a picture of the other sister, but when I go on vacation, these people are always there. And I always got a kick out of the way they walk in with their inner tubes on them. And they're not doing this because they're pretending to be ballerinas, although that's what they look like. But there's this kind of this little rocky area you have to step over before you get to where it's sandy. So they have their hands out like that so they don't lose their balance. But I always thought, especially the older woman, that she must have some ballet training to hold her hands like that all the time. Okay, next. And these are, again, I love doing inner tubes. I like the colors, even the black ones. I like the colors in them. This is some friends of mine. This is pictures I took from years ago. The pictures themselves are, again, they're 4x6 printed photos. They're not digital. So anyway, inner tubes are some of my favorites. Next. Okay, I did a whole series of dog show paintings. I think I did about 30 of them total. Some watercolor, some pastel. The pastel in this one is the bottom right one. The other two are watercolors. And I was telling Jane the other day, one thing I found that kind of scared me, but I'm glad I explored it. But I took all the paintings of the dog shows, framed a bunch of them and took them to the dog show in an attempt to sell some of them. And the people there, like this guy with the Weimaraner, he's a professional dog handler, and he was very flattered that I'd painted him many times, but he didn't buy anything. But anyway, this other guy came over, and he was, of course, a lawyer. And he said to me, he said, if you paint from photographs of people that you don't know, do you need to have their permission? And I thought, oh my gosh, everything I do is from a photograph of a person I don't know. Am I supposed to go get their written permission after I take a picture? So I found out that each state has a way that artists can get information that they need for free. You know, they're not going to represent you if you're sued or anything, but you can ask a question. So I had to write this very formal request. Back then it was Franklin Pierce University was the big law school in New Hampshire. And I got my reply. And had I crossed any lines? Well, maybe, because the law is more of protecting people who are doing what they make their living at. And they told me it's all geared towards, you think of Paul Newman's salad dressing, you can't use Paul Newman's image to sell something else. So maybe I crossed the line because I'm making money, showing this guy who's doing his profession. In the one with the Irish setters, you know, of course, you don't see the woman's face with the blue suit on. That's a professional handler. You can always tell the difference because the professional handlers always wear a suit, and the owner handlers will dress in this flowing skirt type of thing. So that other woman is just one of the owners. So anyway, I found that out, and it made me feel better. So I don't have to ask my inner tube ladies for permission anymore. Okay, next. Okay, here's more of, I love swimming myself. There's a triathlon nearby me that it's beautiful in the morning if the sun's out. There's lots of sparkle, which I love sparkle. And again, I also like to paint black without using black. So 2 of these are watercolors, the one on the top right and the bottom left, and the opposites are pastels. Okay, next. Okay, this is probably a thing of the past. I found I have not been able to do any Bob House paintings for 2 years because people aren't putting Bob houses out anymore. And a lot of it is because of global warming. There wasn't any ice around here until the first week of February. And so nobody put any Bob houses out. I guess they have to take them in March. Anyway, that's the law. And instead they buy these tents, and they can just pop them any way they want. They're easy to set up and take down. So I guess you're not going to see this much anymore because people aren't going to want to drive out on the ice and drag their Bob houses. Okay, next. My juggler series, again, trying to decide what you want to say about each one. The one on the right, it's the same guy, but I was really fascinated with those shorts and his man bun and all that stuff. So I featured those, whereas the one in the middle, I was more interested in the action. Okay, next. I do a lot of fishermen and boats. And again, boats are something that it's hard to draw on location. I guess a lot of it is that maybe I don't know enough about boats, but their perspective is hard to get. And so I usually do it from a photograph. Next. My skier series. Actually, 3 of these are watercolors. I didn't realize I put 3 watercolors in it, but the pastel one is the one on the left. And I like doing the snow too, because again, you get a lot of sparkle in the snow, and the fact that it's white, but it's not really white. Okay, go ahead. Okay, and this last one is just showing my studio setup. The top one there, those trays, some of you might know Dakota used to sell them. I don't know if they do anymore, but my husband said to me, buy 2 and I'll make the rest. So I bought 2, and he made me 10 more. And so my pastels, and they stack up and they fit in that gray rolly thing there when I'm when I need to use it, my table for wood cuts or whatever else I feel like doing. But my husband will tell you why Dakota doesn't sell them anymore. Because I think when I bought them, they were 2 for $100. And he said, I can't believe they can sell them for that cheap because it took forever to mill out all those little pieces and get them put together. My easel there, I always keep my ribbons. I've got a few now. And it's not because I'm very sure of myself or anything, because I'm usually not. But I just think it's a good idea to keep your ribbons and put them up somewhere where you can see them, because we all get in the weeds and we all get discouraged when we don't get into shows. And so when you walk into your studio and you look at that piece on your easel and you go, that's a mess. What am I going to do with that? You can just at least look up there and say, well, I did a few that people liked anyway. So I highly recommend that. I don't have a picture of the other side of my studio, but I also hang up things that are written that judges have said about my work, so I can go over and refer to those as I'm going. And just a note on that, when we talk about shows and getting discouraged about that, because I also do watercolors. Pastel, really, we have a big opportunity to show, win awards, and we can get into PSA without having to get into enduring brilliance 3 times. American Watercolor Society, you have to get into their show, which is really hard. There's a lot of watercolorists, and what they maybe select 100 pieces out of a few thousand. So it's hard to get in, and you have to get in 3 times to be a signature member. I went to a New England Watercolor members, not show members meeting, annual meeting once, and their person demonstrating was probably 90 years old, and he finally got into AWS. It took him 35 years to get in. Like, I don't think I want to wait that long to get in. And again, in New England, we have a pastel society in just about every state, I guess, except Rhode Island, and 2 in Massachusetts. So there we have a lot of opportunities to do member shows and national shows. New England Watercolor Society is just one for the whole New England region, and their national show is every other year. And then on the opposite year, they have a regional show, and both of them are very, very hard to get into because, again, there's a lot of people there. Okay, if there are any questions, I will take them.
Yeah, Alexa, can you unmute everybody? And anyone who wants to ask Terri anything or just say anything to her. The presentation, I think, was really fascinating. I mentioned this to you before when we were going over it, that I find the intensity, the discussion of intensity as one approach, really fascinating. So I'm sure other people have things that particularly struck them. So anybody who wants to ask Terri anything or say anything, go right ahead.
You should all be able to unmute yourselves now if you want to chat. So.
No questions whatsoever.
I just want to comment. I love your figures. I think there's a happiness in almost every single one of them, whether it's the energy or the color or what the people are doing, but there's just a joy, a joyfulness in your work. And it's really lovely to see.
That is true. Yeah. Anybody else? Any comment or question? She was incredibly thorough.
I have a question. I am wondering about working on that kind of a surface, because I usually work on a sanded paper. I use a lot of different ones. And I recently tried working on top of a watercolor, and I really hated it. And I felt like I could hardly get any layers on. So
well, watercolor paper is rough. I don't like working on it either. Actually, the one that's of the 3 people on the beach that is in that lower slide that's on the screen right now, that's on that was a failed watercolor, and I went over it, but it does bother me, that texture. And that's why Reeves BFK, I like that. It's a smoother texture. and you can do a watercolor underpainting on it. If you're using watercolor paper or Reeves paper, you need to stretch it, which means that you're going to wet both sides. My boards have, you can see it. Well, I don't want Jane to have to go way back, but I take plywood. I cover
I
it with
can.
news-
Where? Which one do
way
you want?
back to the picture of my husband.
Like very far back to the beginning?
Way back, yeah. It's the where I show how I do the drawing.
The site sizing
There, right there.
here.
Yeah, there,
Either
there
of
you
those are fine. Okay, so that is Reeves BFK. And so I have a piece of plywood, or I have several in my studio. And you wet both sides of the paper. And then you can see where you see my fingers over here at the right. You can see staples right above my finger. You staple it and you pull it not too tight, because when paper dries, it shrinks. If you pull it too tight, the staples are going to rip out. So you just want to keep it snug. And then you go over I just go over the staples with tape so I don't wreck my pastels or get my finger caught on them. And then you do your underpainting, which if I'm going to go do a model, which we don't have that much opportunity anymore to do a live model, I just paint my paper as CAD scarlet like this. Or if I know the model is going to wear red, I'll do turquoise or something like that, but a warm middle tone where I can go lighter or darker. But that's how you would work on either watercolor paper or Reeves BFK. Watercolor paper does come hot press, which is totally smooth, but I'm going to tell you right now, I already tried it, it doesn't work. The pastel doesn't stay on it at all. But the Reeves BFK, it does stay on. I find I can put as many layers on it as sanded paper. And I don't always write down when I frame things what I used for a substrate. And I can't tell you by looking at them which ones were done on sanded paper and which
go. That's
they
interesting.
look the same. And
Reeves
again, it's
BFK
very
is
forgiving. You can just,
Or do you use a pastel ground or a clear gesso on your watercolor paper? Because that's sized and kind of slick.
no,
Not at all. Huh. Cool.
the pastel stays on the watercolor paper. It's just what I think she was talking about that's disturbing is there's a texture. And so if you want your picture to look somewhat smooth, you're going to see whatever color is underneath is what's going to happen. So you need to plan for that when you're working. You can fill it in the tooth of the paper, but you're going to use your stick up pretty, you got to really press down and use your finger and smudge it.
Yeah, and there comes a point where it won't accept any more pastel. So you're just rubbing over it and it's not sticking because there are too many layers.
Yeah, well, again, you can take that off with water. You're going back to what I call, if I'm in a good mood, I call it earth tones. If I'm in a bad, I call it mud, but you're going to go down, the colors are going to mix and it's going to be brown. But again, I've taken off huge portions of things on Reeves BFK and gone over it again, and it's fine.
Well, that's printmaking paper, so it's really tough. I mean, it can withstand a lot. You can do embossings and all sorts of things on it because you soak it first.
Right.
And that's why you can take stuff off.
Yeah, watercolor paper, I've taken stuff off that too. In fact, Sally Strand does a lot of hers on watercolor paper. She was the one that showed me how to stretch it on the plywood. You've got to have that newsprint underneath it because you're using pastel, and it would be like doing a rubbing, like a gravestone rubbing. If you've got a texture underneath that from the plywood, so you've got to get rid of that.
Incidentally, talking about Charlie Reed, I studied with him for about 15 years.
Yeah.
And he doesn't I don't want people to get the idea that he's holding his brush over his painting and trying to drip in specific spots. Because first of all, he works upright. His board is vertical. It's not flat like a lot of watercolors do. And he actually takes his brush and flicks the paint in the area that he wants drips. Well, he passed away now, but he used to flick his paint and kind of just aim it. And it was not totally random, but it was, and it wasn't also exactly
Wasn't
planned.
exactly planned. Okay.
Right, right.
Uh,
And
Any
he
other
drew,
questions?
he actually drew very fast.
Yeah.
But you know, he wanted you to have your drawing correct, so he might make you take as long as you needed to get the drawing correct.
So it's almost noon. Any other questions? will just make one mention if anybody wants to look him up. I think it's Bruce Gomez who always paints pastel on watercolor paper. I have no idea what he does, but I see his stuff on Instagram all the time and it always says pastel on watercolor paper. So you might look him up and maybe contact him if you're interested in that. Any further questions or comments for Terry? Because if not, we will go to the show. Anybody else? Thanks, Terry, again for your generosity in sharing your process. And it was great to see how prolific you are. So now for the show. This year we have 115 paintings from 62 artists. And that's even more than we had last year. We had a great show last year. And a number of these paintings this year are from brand new members. So welcome to those of you who are new members and who entered the show this year. So now we're going to view the show in silence. There's no music. All 115 paintings. And it's going to take, because there are 115, it'll take, I think it's 9 minutes and something seconds. So I am looking for that little arrow. Here it is. Well, that is our 2023 members show. Pretty impressive. I don't envy you your job, Terry. Do you want to give your overall comment about the show? And then we will move on to give the awards. Terry, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Jane and the people at CMPS for giving me the honor of judging your show. And I recognize that most of you have submitted your work to many shows, as I have, and discovered that one piece might be rejected from a show and then it will go on to win a major award in the next one. So trust in yourself, please trust in yourself. The fact that you've chosen to put a piece out there for observation by an audience or a juror means that it's survived the first round of judging. It has survived your garbage can or being painted over. And you must have considered it worthy, and that speaks volumes because we're always our own strongest critic. As a former public school art teacher, I often had to select student work for various shows and had to walk that delicate balance of choosing just a few of many worthy pieces and making sure feelings were not hurt. It was the least a favorite aspect of my job. And I taught middle school, so that's saying something. After retirement, I was asked to judge with one other person, the local art in the park. I thought it would be easy given the recent trend of allowing crafts. And oftentimes the crafts weren't art crafts, they were kind of grandma potholder type of things. So I thought that would make my selection easy. I arrived at the park and saw this beautifully done, huge painting of the Vietnam Memorial with the artist's family and their reflections. Even though the artists had many paintings in their booths, they were only permitted to select one for judging. That was my immediate pick. However, the other judge felt that because another more famous artist had done that subject, that she was copying an idea that someone did before. We argued for a long time about what was plagiarizing in art. It was her family, her photo references, and isn't the Vietnam Memorial about reflecting on your own thoughts? Wasn't that what Maya Lin was envisioning in her design? I pointed out that there were at least 20 paintings of Mount Washington and another 10 of the Jackson Covered Bridge. Those are our local iconic scenes. Anyway, he threatened to walk out if the Vietnam Memorial piece got any prize at all, so I had to acquiesce. We finally agreed on a still life of tomatoes as the piece. And so 2 judges, both with training in art, and we had entirely different views on what should win. So here it is. I went through the slides many times, wishing I had more prizes to give out. There's only 6 prizes, and tried to examine each piece objectively. But in the end, I went back to what spoke to me. Which pieces did I continually stop on, step away from the computer screen and walk back to? And so just as back in my art teacher days, I know many of you, your styles, your strengths, and your creativity. And I hope you understand if your beautiful piece did not win a prize this time, because there were a great many paintings. And like I said, only 6 prizes.
So let's get on with it with those 6 prizes. We all wish there were more because this is a beautiful show. So we will start with our honorable mention for developing artists, and it goes to Luisa Guzman for her self-portrait.
Okay, I liked both the images that Luisa submitted. It's clear that she has a knowledge of portraiture and the application of the medium. There are lost and found edges and the ability to restrain from over finishing all areas of the painting so that the viewer is directed toward the most important aspects of the piece. And the mark of a good portrait is not just a likeness, but a feeling of what the person is like. Even though I've never met this girl, this pensive portrait with a bit of twinkle in the eye makes me want to get to know her. Nicely done. And no, I didn't know it was a self-portrait.
Beautiful. And for our Developing Artist Award goes to Kristen Varian for her painting Brandon Falls.
I love the energy in this piece, everything about the composition, the diagonal of the rocks, the thundering waterfall, those gentle cascading plants hanging on for dear life, all contribute to the movement in the scene. The artist is an incredible mark maker and it seems effortless. A few strokes suggest rocks, rushing water, and foliage. I hope in her artistic journey, she recognizes that this is one of her innate skills and continues to feature this in her work. It's important as we study and seek to improve our work that we also hang on to those skills that are innate.
That's interesting and apt comment. Honorable mention goes to Dave Caphammer for Painter at Work.
I love the use of perspective leading the viewer into the painting, not letting us stop too long to watch the man painting. After all, he's busy. The composition seems to tell us of a beautiful sunny day, and as we walk down the street, we notice the man painting, but then we keep going, allowing him to continue undisturbed. Instead of the perspective lines leading us to the central figure, as the Renaissance artists often did, the perspective lines lead us away from the figure, an unexpected use of perspective, but in this case, very effective in conveying the intent. The piece has a lot of confidence, both in drawing skills and especially in the confident selection of color. Even on my computer screen, it's easy to see that he chooses his colors carefully so that no layering is required. And that's tough to do, getting it right the first time. Simple blocks of color, nothing to distract from the intent. Well done.
For third prize, we have Jeff Fioravanti, Count the Waves.
Such a dynamic painting, the strong use of diagonals give the piece its movement. The artist has such a command of the medium to be able to clearly show us the unyielding rocks and the transparent water. The splash is gorgeously handled. And I love the varying blues, particularly the cool blue in the tide pools, making me want to take off my shoes and soak my feet. But the energy is so strong that I know it probably not be such a good idea. I'm reminded of my years vacationing at Pemaquid and all those signs warning you not to wade around, as no one who has ever fallen in has ever been rescued. So one of those nervous mother things, I guess, but I feel like I'm about to grab some child by the shirt when I look at this. And I'm in awe of the rocks. I always admire a great rock painter, and this artist is one indeed. Round and angular, smooth and granular, all at the same time. Nice piece.
In second place, Anu Vedagiri for Hot Chai.
I couldn't stop looking at this piece. On my first pass, being someone whose training is largely figurative, it was drilled into my head about the importance of lost and found edges. And that yellow sweater has the same distinct edge almost all the way around. And it's right up front. So in theory, it should stop my eye from going any further. But each pass through the slides, I kept stopping and looking around through the marvelous story the artist was telling me about this interesting man in a restaurant and all that was happening around him. So the morning after I looked at it first, I was, excuse me, out driving, doing errands, and I passed by a yield sign and noticed myself doing the same thing. Saw the sign, and then I slowed down and immediately started looking around to see why I was supposed to yield. I love the way that line is handled in this piece. Again, it brought me back to my art teacher days, using line not only to delineate, but also to entertain, as is done in the background, and to tell us about form. And this is done with the cross contours in the sweater and the cap, as well as the beard and the hair. And that yellow is such a difficult color to feature. It's so difficult to change the hue. You move it a tiny bit towards red, and most of us say orange, a little towards blue, and we all say green. It takes a ton of white to get it lighter and almost no black before someone says, nope, that's not yellow. But here we have a marvelously modeled and textured yellow sweater. While judging, I only see the image, no names, no titles, but my title for this piece is Yield, Look This Way.
Wonderful. And in first place, Yael Maiman, There She Goes.
In my talk, I emphasize the importance of working in a series. It enables you to explore all the aspects of the subject, gets you beyond the usual interpretation. It makes it so that you don't have to put everything you think of in one painting, a tendency I always fight with myself to avoid. I've never seen this artist do anything except cats, nor do I care if she ever does. She seems to keep exploring their form, their affect, and does them in interesting ways. Her other piece is equally worthy, but I tend to gravitate to both the color and the message about cats in this one. Not being a cat person, my experience with them is less about the cuddly kitty and more about the elusive sly cat, adept at maneuvering the urban darkness. I love the color selection in this one. There's a clear dominance of dark, cool shades, and then the hot, bright pinks and warm colors give us some relief. The cool turquoise green on the windshield clearly says that it's nighttime. The rendering of that wrought iron fence is spot on, but done in the same loose manner as the rest of the piece. The artist is clearly masterful draftsman, as is evidenced by the fence and the accurate pose of the cat, but she chooses to make this of secondary importance as she wows us with color. This is an artist whose work we all recognize, as she receives many awards. And even though I've seen a lot of her pieces, I continue to be amazed by her creativity and her skill. There is a part of me that wanted to give the top award to someone who hasn't seen as many awards as she has, but in the end, this is the piece I kept thinking about. This is the one that I kept saying, I wish I had done that.
Well, that is it for our member show. As Terri said, you know, there are so many pieces that are worthy here. And I actually, as I was going through the show, really thought a lot of the paintings in our member show were candidates for our national show. And so I would encourage those of you who want to enter it. And that is what I'm going to end with. Our submissions are open for marks of distinction. And you have until July to submit. But I honestly, every time I see this membership show, I'm always so amazed at how much work is being done, including by artists who are really under the radar. And so think about it, right? And for those of you who usually submit, I hope you will submit again. You can all unmute yourself if you want to say congratulations to the artists, which I certainly do, or to thank Terri again. Terri, you had a number of comments in the chat thanking you, and congratulating, of course, everybody else as well. Anybody want to say anything to any of the artists? Anybody want to go see any other piece? The show is now up. Right, Alexia, the show is up and it is available on YouTube as well. So on the CM Pastels YouTube channel. So beautiful show, everybody. Congratulations to all the artists. And
thank you.
You are welcome. And to all the award winners, you'll be hearing from me probably on Monday about your awards. So thanks, everyone. If that is it, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and just wave you all goodbye.
Thank
And,
you.
Hope
Thank
to
you
see
so
you
much.
at Marks and
Thank
Distinction.
you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Terri.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.